This week we're talking about one of the most interesting aspects of research for a lot of social workers, in part because in some of the stories I'm going to talk about today, the examples, the social workers are the stars, but also I think that the idea of ethics in research is a much more approachable subject for a lot of social workers, because as social workers we're very concerned with ethics and proper conduct and doing things the right way. We talk a lot about that in clinical classes, what's an acceptable or ethical approach to working with clients. But the same thing is true in research. There's a set of very important ethical principles that have been developed for a very specific set of reasons. And we're going to talk about what some of the studies that led to the development of those ethical principles, what those ethical principles are, and then some important concepts in ethics in research. What is ethics? So ethical behavior is a set of standards to ensure moral behavior. That's one way of looking at it. It's also a set of standards to determine what is proper and improper behavior. So essentially what we're trying to do is set a line between this is acceptable, this is unacceptable, and we're going to do so with a set of criteria. Now, the thing is, ethics is different from values. Values are what you find good or important in the world. You can conduct research that has poor values from your point of view, but is still considered ethical research. And you can do research that has very good values, but is unethical. So ethics and values are not the same thing. The important things about ethics is that it is a set of standards that help individuals somewhat objectively identify what is acceptable behavior from what is unacceptable behavior. And in research, we're essentially going to be deciding a set of rules that govern how we as researchers interact and inform and discuss and work with research participants. Most of what we're going to talk about today deals a set of rules and guiding principles and elements that we use to decide what is ethical research and what isn't. But we didn't arrive at these set of principles from nowhere. We arrived at them because of some very specific examples. So starting probably with the Nazis in terms of modern ethical research principles, as you probably know, there was this group of people in Germany in the 1920s and 30s and into the 40s that had a very specific set of ideologies that dehumanized whole groups of people, whether it's Jews or gypsies or people they identified as homosexual or a whole host of other categories of disabled people. And those people that they considered subhuman, they felt that they could operate on in any way they wanted to. So there are very famous studies of Nazi scientists, for example, subjecting people to very cold temperatures and seeing how low they could drop the temperature before that person would die. It's not hard to see that as unethical research, but in the process of doing so, and certainly post-World War II, it was very clear that we needed to have some ground rules that would say what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And there were a whole host of conventions and treaties signed around what is acceptable research and what is unacceptable research. So that's the stuff that happened in the 40s internationally. But there were some very important things happening here in the United States too that have come to be very influential in helping us think through what is unethical versus ethical research. The first and probably the most famous of those examples is the Tuskegee experiment. So let me get this straight, in 1932 in Tuskegee, Alabama, in conjunction with Tuskegee University, a hospital there, a federal hospital in Tuskegee, began to recruit participants in a study for, unbeknownst to the participants didn't know what the study was about, but the study was about understanding the course of syphilis. And at the time, there was no treatment for syphilis in the 1920s when the study began. And so they would give the guys food and they would treat them reasonably nicely. They got goodies that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten if they didn't participate in the studies. And then they followed those individuals about half, there was about 600 individuals, a little more than half of whom had syphilis and a little more than half of whom didn't have syphilis. And they followed them over time. And the idea was to understand the course of syphilis, the course of the disease, and to get a clear sense of what the symptom presentations are and things like that. By 1947, penicillin had been developed and specifically was very effective at treating syphilis. Syphilis is a relatively minor disease with gonorrhea and chlamydia now, whereas back then syphilis was a very, very bad disease to get. So by about halfway through the study, we had a treatment for syphilis. The investigators didn't want to interfere with their knowledge collection. They devalued the human life in that way. And so what they ended up doing is following these folks till the 1970s, till 1972. And in 1972, there was this wide publicity about the ongoing use of this population of exclusively African-American sharecroppers in Alabama that were not being provided with treatment despite the knowledge of the researchers that there exists a treatment that is very effective and that these individuals have syphilis. And so there was a huge controversy about that, obviously, and a whole bunch of congressional hearings. Now, a couple of things about this. First of all, it was in 1966 that Peter Buxton, a social worker, found out about this study and began to complain and complain and complain. And it wasn't until 1972 when he realized that his complaints through the hierarchy of the CDC and other health organizations wasn't getting him anywhere, that he went public with the knowledge. So it was a social worker following his ethical principles of social work that brought this to light. And there were several other people that participated in it. Well, a lot of people were alarmed by the ongoing syphilis study. So what happened there is an awareness that you have to give people the best treatment available. You have to provide information to participants. They have to willingly participate in the study. And these things have to happen automatically, and they have to be externally monitored because investigators can't be trusted to do this themselves. Investigators will sometimes privilege knowledge gathering over the subjects that are participating in their studies, and that's not how we want to operate in society. So you put together this Nazi example with Tuskegee, and you got a lot of pressure to develop a whole host of infrastructure to ensure ethical research, and we're going to talk about that. I want to briefly talk about two other studies that illustrate other components of important elements of ethical research. So one of them is the Milgram study, and there's a movie out right now on the Milgram study. I'm posting on Blackboard a link to a Radiolab episode that discusses in much further detail some of the findings of the Milgram study, which I'm not going to cover here, but are very interesting. And you can listen to those as you please. So the Milgram study, Stanley Milgram was a researcher at Yale University who, following the Holocaust, wanted to understand why and how people follow authority. So he set up this experiment where he recruited subjects who were going to be the teachers, and they were going to deliver information and test and try to teach the learners. And so the learners were these people behind this glass door. There's a photograph up here. You can see sort of the diagram of the experiment. And so the learner was supposedly the one being experimented on, but it was actually the teacher that was the one being experimented on. So the way the experiment went was this. The learner would sit in a room behind a glass window, behind a wall, so the experimenter, the teacher couldn't see them. The teacher would ask them questions. When the learner didn't answer the questions correctly, the teacher would then press a button and zap the learner. And the idea was electric shocks would induce the learner to learn more. And so as the learner kept missing, the confederate, one of the other people involved in the experiment, would turn up the dial, and it would get more and severe shock, more severe shock. The learners would start screaming, and eventually you'd get to the place where they were delivering, hundreds of volts to the person, and the person would stop responding. And the confederate, the person involved in the study, would instruct the teacher to continue to press the button if the learner did not respond. You must keep pressing the button. And the experiment was to see how many people would stop the experiment, how many people would continue and just obey the authority. And so it produced some useful information. And again, you can listen to the Radiolab episode to hear more details about what happened in terms of the results of that study. But there was a harm done to the participant of the study, who was really the teacher, because now that person has been exposed to doing some dark things. Pressing a button until you think you've killed somebody is an unpleasant experience. And so there's things we can do to people through the process of experimentation that can harm them, and those harms can be psychological. So that's another component that we've sort of gathered and incorporated into our set of ethical guidelines for research. And finally, there's a study called the Tea Room Study done by this guy, Laud Humphreys. And he was doing his dissertation I think in St. Louis is where it was. And what he wanted to understand was male public sexual behavior and who these guys were that went to bathrooms to have sex with other men. This was a bathroom in a park. It was at night. These guys would meet up there, and it was sort of random sexual encounters. And what Laud did is he would go and he would take photographs and write down the license. Probably back in the day, he didn't have a cell phone since in the 70s. He would write down the license plate numbers of the individuals, and then he would use some contacts he had at the DMV to find out who those people were. And then he would go to their house and he would interview them. He wouldn't tell them that he recruited them by stalking them at a place where they were having clandestine sexual encounters with other men. He would go to their house and ask them a series of questions, and then he wrote this book on who he found and who the individuals were that were engaged in this kind of behavior. And he sort of it's not just the perverts, it's a wide variety of your respectable community folks that are participating in this behavior, was sort of his outcome. But he didn't inform participants that they were involved in a research study and how he had recruited them. And so all of these things, from denying treatment to people, denying the best care, to not informing people that they're participants in a research study, to the harms that can be done to individuals psychologically, a whole host of these examples came up in the 70s that really drove an agenda to develop a more robust infrastructure for vetting what is ethical research and what is not ethical research.